Beginnings. Beginnings are always hard. You start with a blank sheet of paper, blinking cursor, a random floating idea. Many, they just stop there, having no tolerance or patience for creative endeavors, preferring to spend their time shoring up or improving existing systems. Others ponder, they think, and eventually, something happens. Spark, an idea. Vague at first, then over time, slowly coming into focus. Anyone who has a project that they started from scratch will know that feeling. The elation of having something that started out as nothing turn into something. It's even more daunting when you have little to no experience in the medium that you're working with. Such was the experience a young Hiroji Kyote found himself in as part of Nintendo's crack development team, Research and Development 1. He and one other engineer were tasked with coming up with a new game title for the NES. The system had recently had a multitude of hits in Zelda and Super Mario World, and Nintendo was eager for more. They were simply told to throw something together and left to work at their own pace, which for most people would have been very daunting, but the two took it in stride, trusting that guidance would come near the end and it would all come together. Gunpei Yokio, the head of R&D Team 1, wanted something to rival Miyamoto's rise to fame in the company. He had once been Miyamoto's boss, you see, and since Mario took off, Miyamoto had his own development team, creating a bit of rivalry between the two. Yoke obviously wanted something successful to take him down a notch or two. He wanted something atmospheric, something where the environment itself could tell a story. In short, he wanted something more cohesive than Super Mario Bros. Not bright and colorful, but gritty and real, something more visceral and dark that could pull players in. So it was that Quixote started work with just him and one other on the character designs and movement. They were given a shocking amount of free reign and very little direction for something so important to their manager. But they had faith again that guidance would come near their end and kept working. Designing many of the set pieces and monsters took a 10-month period. Deciding early on they wanted to do a more sci-fi theme and something more action-oriented, they looked to popular movies at the time, easily finding inspiration in the movie Alien. They took many of their cues and set pieces from that movie, which is no surprise given the sharp yet sleek angles to the vicious horns and fangs the enemies have in the game. Just looking at many of these enemies, you can almost imagine the drool and the vicious anticipation the monsters would have when waiting for their unsuspecting prey to come close. It was perfect for the mood they wanted in the game. They also wanted multiple bosses to challenge the player as they navigated. Kraid and Ridley were created as lieutenants to the malevolent Mother Brain to act as guardians to her resting chamber, where the player would have their final conflict. Once these three were ready, it was time for a lead. The main character they wanted almost to be like an android, so Quixote came with almost a robot-like antagonist that the player would spend their time playing. In fact, that's where the name Metroid came from. It's a combination of Metro and Android, where Metro would indicate underground, and Android the type of antagonist. Combine the two, and you have Metroid. It wasn't until several months of development time that someone put two and two together and stopped and said, "Hey, wouldn't it be cool if the main character was a girl?" Given the inspiration they had pulled from an Alien, it seemed a good fit. And the idea stuck, giving Nintendo its first female lead in a game. Up until this time, all the other female characters Nintendo had done had either been supporting characters or some sort of object to be saved. This would be the first one to take the center stage, which was fairly revolutionary for Nintendo at the time. She was much tougher than Mario. She was well armed and well trained, and you knew immediately upon seeing her with her iconic blaster arm and the tight movement that she had that this character was a force to be reckoned with. Who needed to avoid enemies when you could blast them to pieces or blow them away with bombs, after all? They named her Samus Aran, after the soccer player Edson Arantes do Nascimento, who they mistakenly thought was named Samus Arantes Nascimentos. My apologies for massive mispronunciations. Lastly, they decided that she had a no-nonsense personality to match with Sigourney Weaver in Alien and the look of Kim Basinger. They had their lead. The lead was set, the monsters were set. It was time to figure out what else they could do to make it feel vastly different from the pudgy plumber turned hero. It was then that they decided they wanted the movement to be tighter. They wanted to be able to stop immediately instead of momentum carrying you like in Super Mario Bros. They also wanted more of an open world concept. Where Mario had stages and worlds with themes, they wanted this to feel like part of one seamless world where exploration played a key factor in how to navigate it. To do this, they would add power-ups that the player would gather. These weren't your standard Mario power-ups with timers and temporary benefits. These were lasting augments to the character that would drastically change how you could approach navigating the world itself. This would lead to the player inevitably going back and forth in many of the environments as they gathered more tools, giving them more freedom to explore this dark and eerie world that they found themselves in. That's where Makoto Kano came in. It was his job to build the world itself and determine how it flowed, setting much of the tone how the game would feel by making the world dark and foreboding, yet compelling at the same time. They were on to something now, and they could tell. They worked like this for months, toiling away just the two of them, till it was nearly 3 months to release. It was then that the full force of R&D Team 1 would collapse onto the project, kicking things into high gear. Once the full team was there, they took this opportunity to tweak the movement, make it so the colors and the corridors would change, giving the player more cues as to where they were in this vast open world the two designers had made. Much of the audio would be added at this point, as the two had not really had time to work that into the game as of yet. It was around this time that the music got added to fit the mood of the game. They didn't do any kind of pop-style music that you would hum from Mario and many other games at the time. It came in more minimalistic style of music. They wanted to enhance the mood, the sense of foreboding the game was meant to inspire in the players. It was then that they started talking about different endings. Right away, they wanted to reveal that Samus was a woman. That part was clear. But it was after that that they wanted to add more endings for people who went through the game with faster times or secret codes, as playing through the game multiple times was very common in this era of video games. The game was finally finished. It was ready for release and dropped on the Famicom Disk System, complete with 3 save slots for the player to save his or her progress. This would be missing from the international release, as the technology of an internal battery to store progress on a cart wasn't fully realized yet, so they changed that to a password system instead. The game sold well, not as well as they would have liked in Japan, which was Nintendo's bar at the time, but it did sell well in the States, and in Europe as well, never rising to the heights of Mario, but finding its own niche of gamers who sought out the challenge and undirected gameplay that this game had to offer. A few years later, in 1989, Gunpei Yokoi had released what many would call his crowning achievement in the gaming industry, the Game Boy. It quickly started outselling even the NES shortly upon its release. Given this new clout that he had garnered from this piece of hardware, took the opportunity to try to bring back Metroid. This time the responsibility for directing would be headed up by the lead character designer from the first game, Kyote. The game faced all new challenges. Gone was the ability to change the color of the corridors to indicate where you are in the world due to the Game Boy's monochromatic screen, so the backdrops would have to be more distinct this time around to help the player navigate. They also wanted to do new suits for Samus as well, but this also faced similar challenges. They decided that the pauldrons would be a good distinctive piece that the players would identify with, giving the character her signature pauldrons that we all know and identify with the character today. The gameplay was also reworked. There was still a significant amount of exploration, but the story was more linear in that it wanted you to hunt down a number of Metroids before opening up a new area, giving you more of a clear goal this time around. They also added many new power-ups, most of which would become staples in the series, like the Spazer Laser Beam, the Plasma Beam, the Space Jump, and the Spider Ball, which was an addition to the Morph Ball that allowed you to climb up surfaces. They also introduced the Jump Ball, which allowed you to jump while in Morph Ball form. This made the Morph Ball far more versatile than it had ever been before. It was also the first Metroid game that allowed you to save your progress and not rely on a code, a feature that's appeared in every single game since. This game was also pretty well received by critics, but also failed to live up to the status of Zelda and Mario. But it did lay some important groundwork that would be used in what is arguably one of the best entries in this series ever. Super Metroid, which started in the fall of 1991, when Makoto Kano came up to Sakamoto and asked him to make a Metroid game for the SNES, saying, "I'll make the environment for it, we should do it." However, it would take them another year to learn enough about the Super Nintendo's hardware to start developing anything for it, in part because it was so different from what they had worked on before. Also because the Super Nintendo was notoriously tricky to program for. needing the video RAM partitioned in just the right way, or risk diminishing the potential the RAM had, or not running at all. Another thing they wanted was to make the game far more cinematic than they'd ever done previously. They wanted to make the camera pan to important parts in the frame, drawing your eye to it so that you knew it was important and part of the story, something rarely ever done at this time. Development started in earnest, with only 3 of the main developers from the previous titles involved. Sakamoto was back in charge, directing this title. Makoto Kano, originally the concept designer, was back as a producer. And finally, Kenji Yamamoto returned to once again put his signature style into the music for the game. Intelligent Systems was spearheading the development of the game this time. They were well known at the time for being one of the best developers on the hardware, and they were very good at explaining to the 3 veterans what the system could do and what it could not do, helping them more expediently lay out the development stages, work out what animations and ideas would work, and what wouldn't work in the game. The development schedule was intense. Yamamoto was even stating that between making sound effects, background music, and programming, he really had no time to relax and clear his head save for his ride home. It was on one such ride home that he stopped. His eyes went wide and he pulled over quickly into a parking lot. He had to do this. He pulled out a recorder, building out a tune for like 10 to 20 minutes. He then quickly went home and worked up a digitized version, and the title music for Super Metroid was born. The team continued to pour itself into development more and more, with the last 3 months being particularly grueling. People would sleep in shifts in the break room, not because they had to, but because they were so absorbed in making the game that much better. Most of the team could hardly stand to leave for any length of time because of how obsessed they were getting with this project. A map system was added into the game to help navigation be easier for the player, and to point out some important item locations. New weapons and suits were added for some of the navigational reasons and others for combat. Sounds were gone over meticulously. Sakamoto was in particular very picky about how the Metroid would sound, and had them record it again and again until it was just right. Day after day they were adding, tweaking, and refining the game, until finally Makoto Kano stood up and said, let's master this up. We're done. The team was shocked and relieved they had done it. After 2.5 years of some of the most intense work of their lives so far, they were done. They were elated and a bit at a loss. The game had been their sole focus for years, and they hardly knew what to do with themselves at this point. Super Metroid went gold as a whopping 24 meg cartridge, at a time where most cartridges were running 2 to 6 meg. This game would go on to claim critical acclaim from critics on multiple best games ever on the SNES list to this day, and be heavily influential in the birth of the Metroidvania style of gameplay. People were eager to see a new entry in the series, especially with the Nintendo 64 on the way. The system came and went, and yet no Metroid game ever graced this system. Wouldn't be until 2010 that Sakamoto would reveal that he couldn't find a way to adapt the game to a 3D setting on the N64. He felt he really wasn't the right person to lead the project. Yet no one else took up the task themselves, so the N64 went without an entry in the series. The next would land not on a home console, but back on handhelds. Metroid Fusion would be the next game released, this time on the Game Boy Advance. Sakamoto picked this over doing the Game Boy Color because the hardware had advanced enough that they could bring something new to the series. But first, he had to impress on his developers the gravity of what they were undertaking. Most of the team came from making Wario Land 4. The majority of them had never really played a Metroid game or even had a good understanding of what it was even about. After playing a bit of it, the team came to the conclusion that this was for the more hardcore gaming crowd. They wanted to find a way to make it more approachable while still keeping to the game's roots. To that end, they made the game more linear, much like Metroid 2, but with more guidance. They also changed the control scheme, making accessing weapons easier for the player, the reasoning being that modern players would not want to deal with the more traditional control scheme of the original Metroid, not with the way modern consoles were made. Once all this was agreed upon, they began working on the story. Sakamoto decided that they wanted to bring players something new rather than just porting over something like Super Metroid. This gave him some freedom to allow his developers to do something that they had been asking to do: update Samus's design. He admitted that he was nervous about it at first. Gamers get attached to characters looking a certain way, and just changing it can have dire consequences. So he said that if they could do it as part of the story arc, then he would be okay with it. The team rose to this challenge, with Samus having a radically different look in this game. The reasoning was that the X-Parasite had infected her, and the Metroid vaccine that they gave her to save her life had changed her radically. It was a clever and interesting twist that allowed them to rework the design that they said had been the same for far too long, and appeasing fans of the series by giving them a good in-game reason to do just that. It was then the team started working on the linear design portion that they had decided on. Where many Metroid games would simply drop you into the game and leave you to figure out how to best to navigate the world and explore it, this team wanted a more cohesive story and path this time around. They decided to use a series of cinematic cut-style scenes to portray parts of the story instead of the typical discovery that was part of most of the earlier titles. They also locked the player down more by collapsing structures, forcing the player forward through new areas to reach older ones instead of leaving it open for backtracking, which was a very large change for the series as a whole. Finally, after much hard work, the team released the game, and it was received very favorably, and is argued by many to be one of the best in the series. The team involved in Fusion, rallied by their success, wanted to take on the challenge of porting over Super Metroid to the Game Boy Advance next, but Sakamoto had other ideas. He wanted to approach the original Metroid. He felt that they could revisit it by adding some new mechanics and some new cinematic story elements to help newcomers ease into the series, likely the ones that just bought Fusion. He wanted people to understand the origins and the world of Metroid better. Little did they know that this would be the last game that Nintendo R&D1 would ever make. The division was disbanded and restructured shortly after the release, and wow, what a great way to go out. Not only had they have a hit in Fusion, but they also re-released Metroid, added more depth to it, more content, and showed people what a great franchise that Metroid really was. It reviewed well, and is often on multiple must-have Game Boy Advance titles lists. Still to this day, it's recognized as one of the best games on the handheld. By the way, if you ever wanted to know where Samus's current Zero Suit came from, you're in luck. This is an extra bit of story added to the game just for Zero Mission. Sakamoto thought it would excite players and make the situation feel real and threatening like something out of a classic horror movie. To that end, they added an extra section after the main credits, where Samus's armor gets heavily damaged in a final battle with Mother Brain. She's then forced to escape armorless. This is a fun little section that focuses more on stealth than combat, as Samus can only stun enemies and not kill them, heightening the tension even more. Right around this time though, Retro Studios was taking Metroid in a brand new direction. While the Game Boy Advance was enjoying some of the best 2D Metroid games in years, Miyamoto and many others from Nintendo were visiting a small but troubled studio in the States known as Retro Studios. Nintendo execs were well known for coming in several times a year and ripping on the games that the studio was working on, according to some of the employees. This time, it was worse. Miyamoto came in hating almost everything they had going on, but took interest in one small title called Action Adventure and spent almost all his time looking at it. This game's description was basically 3 hot girls kicking butt, and almost nothing else. They all thought that Nintendo was going to shut them down at this point, but instead, what they did is they cut almost all their projects, killing off everything except for, you guessed it, Action Adventure. Everyone was very confused at the time, as it was one of the least developed of the 4 games they had going on concurrently. Almost 3/4 of the staff were just straight up laid off. They all thought they were going to be fully shut down any day now. Then, right around the reveal of Project Dolphin, which we now know as the GameCube, they were given the contract to develop a Metroid game for the GameCube. No one knew how, no one knew why. It could be that Miyamoto saw something in Action Adventure no one else did at the time. It could have been that he thought an American team would do the game more justice, as he and many others in Japan never really understood the appeal of the game. It had always been more popular with Western audiences. Regardless, the job was theirs, so discussions began in earnest if it would be a third-person shooter or a first-person shooter. They weren't very confident in their ability to work with the camera well enough in third person, having just recently struggled while working with Rare on Jet Force Gemini. They also reasoned one of the first things that you do when exploring a world in a third-person game is to shift the camera into first person and to explore and look around at your surroundings. That solidified it. Metroid Prime would be a first-person game. They used Super Metroid as their blueprint for the main design and ran into trouble early on trying to get the morph ball working. So much so, they almost cut it from the game entirely and so Miyamoto told them flatly, if you cannot make the transition between first person and the morph ball seamless, you cannot make the game. They poured more time into it, months in fact, until they finally got a simple okay from Miyamoto. It was still game on. Development was grueling in both pace and stress for the small team. Converting a beloved franchise from a 2D adventure game to a first-person exploration game would be daunting for a much more experienced and larger studio, but for the tiny team at Retro, it was even more intense. Overtime each week for over a year was mandatory. Crunch time was just a normal workday for the few that were left on the staff of the small studio. They finished the first level in 6 months. Nintendo approved it and informed them they had less than a year to finish the rest of the game. The work ethic expected got tougher. Expectations from the company were higher than ever before. In the end, when the game came out, they all thought Nintendo was going to cut their losses, fire them all, and hand the IP off to someone else at this point. However, the game was a hit. Retro was here to stay. They had done it. They had done what even Sakamoto couldn't figure out how to do: bring Metroid to the first-person era. They would go on to make 2 successful sequels, Echoes and Corruption, before Nintendo would look to try another direction with the IP. It would be another 3 years before we would see another Metroid game, this time headed up by Team Ninja of all people. There were a few reasons for this. First off, Sakamoto had been playing a lot of Ninja Gaiden lately and was impressed at how smoothly the 3D worked in it while keeping the controls so simple. Secondly, he had been wanting to make a modern Metroid game while keeping the controls as simple as the NES days. He was having issues getting anyone at Nintendo to understand the concept that he was driving for, so he decided to reach out to Yosuke Hayashi, the main lead of Team Ninja, about his idea. Hayashi and Sakamoto hit it off almost immediately. Not only did he understand what he wanted, but he was already very familiar with the Metroid series. Sakamoto would come up with the story himself, and his team and Tecmo's Team Ninja would work to execute it, keeping his desire of a simpler control and more accessible design in mind. This would be a more linear game, and one that honestly many did not care much for in the series itself. It had many criticisms, one of the major ones being Samus herself. She was designed far more sexually than she had ever been designed before. Proportions were far more exaggerated, something not uncommon for Team Ninja's design aesthetic. Her personality was also a bit out of sync with how the character had been portrayed in the past, with her being far more comfortable taking orders to the point that she wouldn't use any of her suit's abilities till explicitly told to do so. This part was actually done for 2 reasons. One, to show her respect for Adam and their father-daughter relationship that they alluded to in Fusion, and to slow down progression of the game. Much like how Fusion would have corridors collapse or be locked out of an area by some other means, the progression in this time was being driven by orders that she was given by Adam. This angered many of the players because the exploration and item acquisition were major parts of the formula of Metroid, on top of the fact that Samus was very familiar with her capabilities and has never hesitated to use any under her command before. The scanning sections were also pretty heavily panned, given that you couldn't move during them at all. They also played more like a Java game than anything in a true Metroid experience. This again was the call of Sakamoto. He didn't want to have to figure out where the player was after they got done with these sections, and was very insistent that the scanning sections be in the game. All of this made for a rather tonally confused end product for most of the player base. To his credit, or detriment, depending on how you look at it, Sakamoto stands by Other M, and thinks it came out just how he wanted it, regardless of its reception, which was good by critics, but far less so by many players I've spoken to. I will admit that Other M had many parts I enjoyed. The combat and how fluid it was, along with the gameplay perspective, was nice. I just wish more had been done to the story. Had this been early in Samus's career, it would have made far more sense. With all this happening just after Super Metroid, her personality and choices don't really make a lot of sense. In the end, it was mostly a divisive game, enjoyed by some, hated by many, oddly fitting with the beleaguered history of the franchise as a whole, always struggling to catch up and surpass the popularity of the pudgy plumber, only to find hindrances with mistiming and mixed audience reception, at least in Japan. With Metroid's 35th anniversary just around the corner, it will be hard to tell what will happen with the IP moving forward. Many are still hoping for Metroid Prime 4, which by all reports is still in heavy development, Rumors also abound of a remaster of Super Metroid for the Switch. Many speculate that the Metroid Prime trilogy is being remade for the system as well. Hopefully we get news for all of these and more in the coming year. Gunpei Tokyo's legacy with Metroid deserves no less respect and celebration than was shown from Mario this year, after all. I'd like to take a moment before we wrap up to thank everyone for watching and remembering Metroid for a time with me. It's amazing to see how many games got made for a series that constantly struggled in Japan. I think overall, Gunpei Tokyo would have been proud of the legacy of the franchise he helped birth and how much joy it's given so many around the world. To that end, I think it's finally time that Samus got to take Mario down a peg. Please enjoy a few minutes of Samus beating the living crap out of Mario in Smash. Thank you for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and until next time, happy gaming.